The theory of institutional disintegration. In contemporary socio-economic studies, there is no theory that would describe the patterns of institutional transformation as a separate factor of socio-economic transformation. As a result, evolutionary behavioral institutional theories, which are the dominant ones, are mostly unable to explain many socio-economic processes associated with institutional development, the formation and transformation of new institutions, the demonetization of the existing rules of behavior, the structuring of local and peripheral markets on the foundations of unusual behavioral preferences of economic agents, the role of instability of institutions in economic development, etc. At what point is unusual behavior transformed into new institutional forms? Why do individuals with deviant behavioral patterns often create innovations? Why do the patterns of institutional development change? These issues are important to understand. The development of the national economy largely depends on their analysis. To describe such processes correctly, one needs new theoretical and methodological tools, which include, in the conceptual framework, the factor of permanent institutional change. I propose a new variant of the institutional theory, the theory of institutional disintegration, as a methodological complement to existing approaches. Its conceptual features are connected with an assumption about inherent fragility and instability of social institutions. This is based on the interpretation of which economic agents form special situational rules, institutional exceptions. In some cases, they can become the behavioral foundations for structuring new markets. First of all, I will review the current methodological situation in new institutionalism and the main practical difficulties with the use of institutional approaches in the analysis of economic processes. I will explain the need to develop new models of institutional development, disintegration, and reproduction of rules of behavior in economic space. Then, I will examine the social nature of institutions. I will formulate the criteria by which one can evaluate the presence or absence of institutions in social space. Then, I will discuss the main assumptions of contemporary new institutionalism from the perspective of the efficient market hypothesis. I will consider the role of opportunism in institutional development and suggest why it is impossible to formulate a set of ideal institutions that are effective in any socio-economic situation. And then, I will discuss the main conceptual assumptions of the theory of institutional disintegration. I will suggest the concept of institutional exceptions and justify their importance in economic development. The processes of institutional transformation will be considered using examples of some submarkets in which the behavior of economic agents is different from the norms that are used in the previous parent markets. In conclusion, I will again describe the main methodological limitations of contemporary new institutionalism and provide the conceptual foundations of the new theory, which may neutralize such restrictions to some extent. The methodological background and the challenges of new institutionalism. Theories emphasizing the dependence of a particular historical evolution on initial institutional conditions dominate contemporary new institutionalism. Behavioral patterns are considered as a social analog of the DNA that predetermine the economic foundations of society, the nature of political relations between the individual and the state, the level of development of legal, social, and cultural values, etc. The institutional choices that society made in the past are deterministically embedded to be followed in line with the chosen path. The shift from the wrong to the necessary path of development is possible but complicated and unlikely. As positive cases, one usually cites examples of Japan, Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Chile, and some other countries that have been able to change traditional patterns of development to the post-industrial ones. All other developing countries are among the negative examples. The right institutions are generally understood as a wide range of standard behavior and axiological attitudes of Western culture, liberal and legal values, institutions of market economy, private autonomy, and personal freedom, etc. The successful development of the national economy depends on the degree of westernization, that is, the presence or lack of institutions which are relevant to Western behavioral patterns and as a rule were moved by Europeans to non-Western territories during the colonial period. The hierarchization of institutions for quality content implies the need for involving the institutional space of non-Western countries under global standards. A non-Western society is regarded as a student who needs to find preferably anticipated answers to some challenges in politics, economy, culture, legal system, political systems, etc. The institutionalists, like commons of the last century, have emphasized the importance of an evolutionary selection as a social mechanism for the preservation of good institutions and getting rid of undesirable norms. The analogy of institutional development with biological evolution implies as a spontaneous emergence of institutions under the influence of more or less random historical, cultural, religious, and/or geographical factors as a social effect of evolutionary mechanisms of natural selection and survival of the fittest. The societies developed with varying degrees of success dependent on the institutions, which became foundations of social life. According to Alchian, the chances of survival with social competition are higher for those groups, the rules of which are more suitable to reality. The researchers of evolutionary economics conclude from this functional background the successful development of some countries means developmental legitimacy in the past. The founding fathers made the right institutional choices. Conversely, a low level of socio-economic development indicates inefficient institutions, which were incorrectly formed in previous historical eras or have been followed unsuccessfully. Some institutions ensured progress, the other ones led to a historical dead end. Since the behavior that is effective in the present will be used in the future, according to Axelrod, the researchers of institutional evolutionism believe it is necessary to transfer the institutional design of the modern Western world in the most complete form to the institutional space of non-Western countries. The institutional transplantation will get rid of dominating inefficient political, social, and legal structures in economic space. If institutional reforms don't provide the expected economic results, GDP growth per capita, low level of socio-economic inequality in society, the development of innovative industries, etc., the shortcomings in institutional implementation are not correlated with theory, but with those who are responsible for its implementation. Academic researchers usually recommend to change the team of reformers and start a new stage of reforms. Kenneth Boulding has showed the logical vulnerability of the functional arguments many years ago. To illustrate the trap of sacrifice, the American economists used an analogy with human victims, which the Aztecs brought to ensure a good harvest. Such actions were not questioned even in the absence of the desired result. The traditional priests simply concluded that not enough people were put to death to achieve the goal. Despite the political popularity of institutional evolutionism among the majority of the academic community and political elite in Western states, it is psychologically comfortable to assume that the institutions around you are better than those in other countries. The heuristic possibilities of the institutional theory of evolution are limited. The sustainable economic growth of countries with non-Western institutional patterns, China, Southeast Asia, Persian Gulf, etc., uneven economic development of Western societies, and the corresponding heterogeneity of the behavioral normative space, some examples of the disintegration of institutions and societal degradation in socially stable countries, a typical example is Detroit, cannot be explained from an evolutionary institutional perspective. The development of institutions is a subject of keen interest for many contemporary economists. However, the processes of institutional disintegration are underestimated. The social nature of institutions. Institutions govern social actions, but human behavior is not deterministic. Although the majority of people observe rules, some can violate these rules. At first glance, the behavioral deviations appear in social space spontaneously and unpredictably. But if a social situation and the structure of interpersonal interactions are well known, random violations are largely embedded in institutional patterns. Before considering the social processes of institutional disintegration, it is important to clarify what is not an institution. Not all behavioral actions have an institutional character. First, there should be regulatory of actions. In the words of Gabriel, institutions are created by constant repetition. If behavioral practice is sufficiently stable, institutions are constructed. A rare and unique case will not form an institution. However, repeatability is not enough. If a rule is not formalized, that is, if it's not possible to point to some document, decree, or order of authorities which regulate such behaviors, it is difficult to ascertain whether a particular action is a manifestation of informal implicit norms or individual behavioral style. From this, one can deduce the next important characteristic, which is anonymity. Links to both the compliance and non-compliance of rules should have an impersonal nature. Otherwise, it is impossible to verify and transmit. The more the norm is objectified, the easier it is transmitted. One of the main differences between the actions of people from the social behavior of animals is manifested in the impossibility of objectified intergenerational transmissions. Although some behavioral actions of chimpanzees are quite complex, some animals that were socialized in the community of people know how to use forks and knives, open bottles, etc. It is unlikely to create a school of learning where alpha males can pass on to younger individuals the skills they have acquired from people. De-individualization allows institutions to become accessible to other societies and humanity as a whole. Following written instructions or adhering to well-known informal rules, any individual will be able to perform actions prescribed by the institution. Individual features of behavior, for example miracles committed by religious preachers, are not institutions because they cannot be de-individualized. Personal habits, preferences, and cognitive skills cannot be pulled from the creator. If the behavior is personalized, it is impossible to predict its nature and dynamics. Thirdly, institution means an alternative. The uncontested behavioral reaction which is biologically, chemically, or physically determined is impossible to call institutional. There are no rules prescribing how to swoon, to strengthen the hand if one touches a hot object, and to recover from anesthesia following a medical operation, etc. There is no institution which can dictate how a person of borderline mental state should jump off a roof, but in the social space there can be informal norms describing expected behavior before committing suicide. Whether it is necessary to prepare a suicide note, put business in order, for example, to pre-buy an insurance policy so that relatives get insurance after death. What is the preferred method? For example, among supporters of radical Islam, the preferred method is Shahidism, etc. One of the storylines of the theatrical novel by Bulgakov is founded on conflicts between the socially normal by shooting method of suicide of the protagonist of the play, which is part of the story in the manuscript that the author of the novel brings to the theatre council, and the wishes of the theatre council, which believes that the actor of the play needs to stab himself. Fourth, institutions describe significant behavior. Society formulates detailed descriptions of the actions, the violation of which can lead to negative social consequences. Those who could potentially be affected as a rule monitor compliance with the rules, or they can transfer relevant powers to the authorities. For the effective functioning of institutions, the interest of at least some social agents is needed. As emphasized by Stinchcombe, institutions cannot exist if there is no concern about foul or possible violations of rules in the community. The guts of institutions is that somebody somewhere really cares to hold an organization to the standards and is often paid to do that. Sometimes that somebody is inside the organization maintaining its competence. Sometimes it is an accrediting body sending out volunteers to see if there is really any algebra course. And sometimes that somebody or his or her commitment is lacking, in which case the center cannot hold and mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. These agents must be willing to spend some time and effort to discuss the problems, propose a sequence of actions aimed at its resolution, talk about the developed behavioral algorithm with someone else. Some institutions are not created simply because there is no need. Consider children spending time at the playground. The child's behavior is determined solely by immediate needs of active rest and spending time cheerfully. There is no need to develop specific institutions that regulate gaming activities. First ride on a swing, then hang on a tourniquet, descend the spiral staircase, etc. But if athletes come to the playground after children have gone home to prepare for competitions, their actions will be subject to clear rules developed by experts, coaches, assistants, doctors, etc. Although both children and professional athletes perform the same actions while running around a stadium, their actions have different semantic and functional target content. Many institutional features are not used in everyday life. These are ready-made answers without questions. In ontology, they are called the possible world. From the point of view of logic and common sense, there can be new institutions as the intersections of some social interactions, but there is no need for society to invest resources in their development and implementation. There are rules in supermarkets that prescribe the procedure to form lines and the character of communications between buyers and sellers. For example, the rules prescribing the need to leave products bought at other stores in a special box at the entrance, or to inform sellers if the purchaser carries them with him, and if such products have names of the same goods put on the shelves. But there are no rules on the order in which purchases must be made. Such actions are not significant. The freedom of behavioral choice is maximum. The existing zone of indifference one can name zero institutions. These are the rules that are not used in social space, but the existence of which is possible from formal logical positions. One should not consider imagined behavior as an institution. The descriptions of biologically, physically, or socially impossible transactions, for example communications with aliens, are not of normative nature. The necessary condition for the emergence of institution is a behavioral action. If there is no action, there is no institution. If there is no goal-directed behavior, there is no reason for the formation of the institution. Until the transaction is implemented in social space, the norm, although formalized in fiction or movies, remains inactive or sleeping. Fifth, institutions are costly. The modern institutional theory doesn't take into account resource constraints. Institutions are considered as a set of behavioral preferences of dominant social groups or ruling coalitions, and not as a problem of cost. The resource constraints can be divided into external and internal ones. The external constraints imply social and technical infrastructures required for the implementation of the rules. Observing rules to remove out clothing when entered assumes dressing rooms, wardrobes, hangers, etc. The rule requiring leaving bulky personal belongings before entering the active zone of swimming pools, gyms, fitness centers, etc. supposes the existence of special rooms for storage, attendance, etc. Internal constraints are the opportunity cost of economic agents. The formation of rules requires high social activities. The more important the norm and the greater economic sphere, which is under behavioral regulation, the more resources one needs for searching, thinking, and discussing institutions. As economists like Hicks pointed out, the price is determined by opportunity cost. Time of interested economic agents, media representatives, experts of non-governmental organizations and academic structures, employees of the legislative, executive, and judicial bodies of power, etc., is limited. To create a formal institution, for example a law, lawmakers are unable to consider all of the precedents and the possible wordings. Only a small number of alternatives is under careful analysis. The importance of resource constraints can be demonstrated in the example of an imaginary economy of Robinson, like the author analyzed. The conditions of the model assume Robinson feeds on berries but decides to make a long stick to maximize productivity efforts, getting to the tops of the trees, where there could be the most delicious and ripe berries. De Soto considers the need to limit consumption to have savings or reserve berries. During a search for suitable branches for sticks, their connections, testing and so on, Robinson will not be able to replenish the food supply promptly. To design institutions described in the form of user instruction, the order of actions required to create tools clarifying the location of trees with suitable branches, the choice of route, preparation of necessary supporting tools, etc. Robinson will also need reserves. When Faraday appears at the island, Robinson will be forced to spend time and effort training the new member of the microsocium how to follow the already developed rules of behavior, and it will lead to the forced period of targeted unemployment again. If Faraday was allowed to use his ideas on how to pick berries and/or to create tools, one will have to spend time and effort on the coordination of different behavioral patterns, or if one fails to achieve an institutional compromise, to develop rules of enforcement, monitoring and control of compliance Friday's actions to expected behavior. The cost of design, implementation, and/or reinterpretation of the rules of behavior are institutional costs. It is necessary to distinguish them from expenditures, which economists call transactional costs. The cost of collecting and processing information, conducting negotiations, making decisions and monitoring their implementation, appeal and review, etc. Consider a football team the coach manager of which wants to have a friendly match. Transactional costs are the cost of organizing meetings of the players, the negotiation and conclusion of the contract. This cost can be considerable. However, there would be no institutional cost since the rules of interaction of players on the field, the expected behavior of the fans and referees, the technical standards of the design of football fields and other sports rules were already formulated by FIFA. Transaction costs are the costs of actions of the agents in the economic space. Institutional costs are costs of the formation of market. As example of the economy of Robinson has shown, the institutional costs are actually high-risk investments in development. The increasing number of rules leads to increased institutional costs. At the same time, social agents have more opportunities for choosing the optimal norms. The growth in institutional capital of society, that is the number and variability of the rules used that promote the well-being of its members. Friday, as a member of traditional society, can teach Robinson more efficient methods of fishing, gathering, or hunting. Although picking berries and catching fish are different types of economic activity and it is impossible to transfer rules directly from one area to another, Robinson will, to some extent, be able to use the results of the previous efforts. For example, he can roughly calculate the time required to develop new institutions. Poor communities are usually unable to invest adequate resources in designing and implementing institutions. The lower the level of economic development, the less the institutional capital in society. Institutional theory and the efficient market hypothesis. The idea of inherent efficiency of some institutions is contrary to the efficient market hypothesis. This is a set of unproven but quite plausible assumptions about nature and the direction of market forces. The supporters of the hypothesis emphasize the unpredictability of the results of economic transactions, which opens up opportunities for short-term arbitrage while limiting its long-term effectiveness. The inability of long-term arbitrage means that in strategic terms at least, there are 2 points of view. Taking into account the different time frames of economic agents, the number of correct points of view can be endless. Which are correct, since economic agents wish to conclude a transaction voluntarily. Although the wings of both sides need not be identical. If only one party buy or sell wins consistently, due to monopoly power or administrative coercion, the market ceases to be efficient. The speculative strategy of profit-taking due to the differences in the value of assets at different markets or regions cannot be sustained. Market self-regulation gradually leads to price equilibrium. If some transactions for some economic agents start to generate a steady income above the average level, this discrepancy will sooner or later be noticed by other players. An overflow of economic actors to the relevant field will occur until the increasing competitiveness lowers the resulting rate of profit to the average market level. Similar mechanisms of arbitrage and self-regulation are in institutional space. Economic agents take or borrow rules of behavior which are clearly interpreted as useful. After 24th of March 2015, when Andreas Lubitz deliberately broke the Germanwings aircraft with 150 people on board, airline companies of many countries, Canada, Germany, Australia, etc., for several days adopted the rule of two people. When one of the pilots decides to leave the cockpit, one of the other crew members must enter the cockpit. The institutional costs in this case were the costs of airline companies to develop new instructions, the time spent on explaining them to staff, developing procedures for monitoring, etc. For example, institutional transmission occurs in sports quickly. New methods and techniques of training are usually passed from coach to coach, from one national team to another with no restrictions. The choice of social norms as regulators of behavior for most economic spheres is caused by a combination of many factors, none of which can be the only reason. Their significance may transform. If an institution is not perceived by all agents as obviously beneficial, if its efficacy for at least some market agents is ambiguous, or if it is reviewed by them under the influence of the social, historical, cultural, and political transformations, there will be inevitably economic agents in society who formulate and implement norms in social space which, according to the functional contents, don't meet the rules of economic cooperation formulated previously. In conditions of uncertainty, it is difficult to predict which institution will be needed in the future and which rules will be useless. It is impossible to construct or borrow institutions which in all conditions remain effective. Guilds of Dutch shipbuilders had originally supported technical innovations, demonstrating the positive role of civil society in economic development, but by the middle of the 17th century, they began to oppose further technological improvements becoming a negative factor for the development of the national shipbuilding industry and letting England achieve dominance in trade routes at the turn of the 18th century. In the 18th century, Ireland moved on to potatoes, which gave more calories per hectare of crops than grains. Over the decades, the nutritional benefits of the new culture were neutralized by the fact that grain harvest began to increase much faster. Camels contributed to the Arab conquest in the Middle Ages, allowing the riders to make multi-day passages, but centuries later, the apparent ease of movement discouraged the construction of roads and railways in Middle Eastern countries. The arbitrary nature of institutional interactions is clearly demonstrated by the game theoretic research of Robert Axelrod. The rules of the tournament of computer programs organized by the American political scientists were simple, although they contained some institutional inaccuracies which would be used subsequently. A strategy would win if it got more points in the competition. The rules of the game assumed each strategy should act against the other program and against itself. During the course of numerous virtual simulations, the winner was the mirror strategy proposed by a famous social psychologist. The program offered cooperation on the first move and then mirrored the actions of the opponent mechanically. After the publication of Robert Axelrod's results with the numerical data for each strategy, some scholars have begun to develop programs with the same altruistic content. However, many researchers began to search for opportunistic possibilities that use of the flaws of the winner strategy. Decades later, researchers from the University of Southampton suggested a more efficient program built in accordance with the opportunities provided by the institutional design of the competition. A team of researchers developed 60 programs. Rules allow this. They change the strategy of moves depending on whether their counterparts have been own or alien. The result of such a division of labor has been the allocation of program leaders who earn competitive scores. Three of them won first places in the tournament, and program altruists who sacrificed their interests and acted solely for the sake of limiting the possible winning points of the competitors. The long history of computer simulations has shown that some economic agents search for roundabout ways even if there are obvious benefits of following the established rules. Different behavior can maintain in a stable institutional environment. If society or some group strictly follows the socially approved institutions for a long time, the optimal behavior for certain economic agents can be adaptive interpretations of norms and opportunism. Opportunism is not so much a weakness but an integral institutional feature of the economic system. First, opportunism tends to maximize the use of apparently inefficient resources and review agreements that are difficult to implement, that are confusing or simply unfair for one of the parties. Second, even the potential threat of opportunism forces society to develop an institutional system of monitoring and control. Third, opportunism gives economic behavior required flexibility. The behavior of social agents acting solely within formally proclaimed norms would be too rigid and ineffective. Socialization involves learning how to behave opportunistically. At school and or university, a student receives the practical skills on not only how and what to learn, but also how to violate formal requirements, get good grades on tests and exams, apply minimal effort through cheating, build informal relations, and use personal abilities to communicate with instructors and teachers, use the imperfection of the rules of control, and the fuzziness of the grades of evaluation, etc. Opportunism allows society to diversify risks by formulating and maintaining norms of behavior that may look unusual, exotic, or deviant for an outside observer. If one knows that the future economy will be Western-style capitalism, it is reasonable to expect emergence of the same market institutions in all countries, but the future is unpredictable. The stability of social institutions are often hypertrophied by social systems which emphasize predestination of selected scenarios of economic development. The determination of the future has an important place in the ecological patterns of socialist and traditional societies. In the language of game theory, institutional choice is determined by whether society considers social development as a game with finite or infinite number of moves. Different societies create different institutions. At first glance, the benefits of diversity are not obvious. If one considers the purpose of evolution as the distribution of life, it is clear only a man can transfer genes to other planets and star systems. However, human survival and the preservation of life without other natural organisms could be threatened. Natural and institutional evolution resembles the behavior of an experienced player at the races who never puts all money on one horse. It is difficult to predict who will win the race, but if there are a lot of bets, the probability of success increases. In accordance with the logic of hedging, a producer who needs a hit sponsors various music groups, and a venture capital investor who wants to become a co-owner of a new global corporation like Facebook or Google invests in several startups, not knowing which rules will be effective in the future. Economic agents seek to establish an institutional design in order not to suffer serious losses, regardless of situational changes. Since individuals have imperfect knowledge about social processes, and the dynamics of institutional transformation is characterized by uncertainty, the evolution of the institutional structure cannot have equilibrium and a sustainable character. Although the experience of social agents and the development of their skills on how to search for and analyze optimal options is important in the construction of important institutions, society often believes that it makes no sense to invest in the development of rules that have a transferable utility and that can be copied from other countries. It is not so much the evidence of underdevelopment of economy or an incorrectly selected historical path, but a rational action, which in game theory is called the second move advantage. The effectiveness of the strategy of borrowing is constantly emphasized by the supporters of modernization theory. Development practices are easier to copy than to create. The advantage of copying describes the social phenomena that Stinchcombe calls the effect of the vulnerability of the new. According to some researchers, there is the advantage of first move. In many game situations, for example sports tournaments, the party which has initiative and/or first move often wins because it limits the response of the opponent's choice the specified frames. Many Chinese pharmaceutical companies just wait for Western corporations to launch a new drug. Further Asian firms find ways to copy patents and release generics a few months later, selling them at a reduced price. It is harder to borrow social norms, which in institutional terminology form specific assets, like Oliver Williamson said. These include religion, culture, tradition, identity, etc. In the 19th century, the economic superiority of Great Britain in comparison with Japan was obvious, and centuries later the roles were reversed. One of the main competitive advantages of the Japanese economy was the high quality of complex technological products, the preservation of which is largely supported by the fact that a large part of Japanese managers and workers adhere to traditional ethics and discipline in relation to the process and results of the work. In the late 19th to early 20th centuries, Japan was able to adopt European institutions for several decades. It adopted to the national laws the Code of Napoleon, financial and insurance laws, administrative standards, and political institutions of the European states. However, Western companies will not be able to motivate their staff to high quality work just by translating the codes of the samurai from Japanese into national languages. Borrowing doesn't lead to success in all cases, although it is obvious that the borrowing agent reduces institutional costs. Sometimes the pioneers manage to break away from the pursuers. In the corporate world, the advantage of innovator often works. Companies creating new technologies in the field of software and e-commerce, for example Amazon and eBay, usually get a larger market share than many imitators. However, such companies must maintain continuous innovation. The efficient market hypothesis emphasizes it is difficult to guess with an institutional choice. Even successful institutional decision means little. It is more important how institutions correlate among themselves. By analogy, with chemical compounds that can form connections, such social quality can be called valence of institutions. Over time, the transmission of other institutions or transformation in social environment minimize initial benefits. To construct perfect institutions is like creating perpetual motion or to find a financial strategy that allows everyone to outperform the market. The theory of institutional disintegration and exceptions from the rules. In contemporary society, the boundaries of institutional violations become unclear. Normative behavior looks not so much as a model for imitation, one as a recommendation or a suggestion, the implementation of which depends on context, along with actions which are relevant to regulatory frameworks. Social agents often choose institutional practices and implement behavioral strategies that don't correspond to conventional expectations. Such actions deform norms. The transformation of rules happens in accordance with the doctrine of justifiable mistakes, like Oliver Williamson said. Society permits some deviations from normative behavior for some people. One cannot always follow formalized rules clearly. Social institutions are rarely formulated with absolute certainty, even after regulating the actions of the recipients. It is impossible to foresee all possible implications. Someone who faces a new situation as a rule may not appeal to the regulatory body to change the norm. The rules are sometimes embodied in social relations as standards, if there are organizations which are responsible for the development and adoption. Such organizations are engaged in the analysis of the situation and problems of the industry, the development of proposals for the improvement of current legislation, reducing differences and selecting treatments, harmonizing standards in order for economic agents to follow the spirit of the principles in any practical situation, rather than trying to find loopholes in the rules that are spelled out clearly. Their discretionary behavior forces people to act at their own risk. The discretionary element of interpretation is not only necessary in the self-reflexive clarification of vague or fuzzy institutional propositions, but also in the opportunistic desire of social agents to use situation-specific interpretation to their advantage. The clarity and obviousness of institutions is called transparency. Full transparency as an integral compliance of the actions of those who didn't participate in the development of the institution to the nature of the actions that its creators would expect in such a situation, in fact, is unattainable. The partial transparency of institutions, similar to the institutional characteristics of multi-agent models, is called translucency. Violation creates social norms. It is impossible to understand why people follow the rules, not find it out how and when they violate them. What is allowed is not less important than what is prohibited. Knowing what society considers deviant, one can understand what is perceived normal or acceptable in society. Knowing which interpretations are considered false and which ones are considered valid, one can understand how new institutions are normalized. Interpreting the institutions, social agents seek to make life more convenient. However, the deviation may be negatively met by the community, particularly its conservative circles. Then the deposit will face sanctions, the severity of which is determined by specifics of his personality and the severity of the offense. Although social agents don't have unlimited freedom of interpretations, the rules create incentives to generate exceptions to the rules. Institutional exceptions are binary behavioral oppositions to dominant norms. Their significance and the algorithms consolidating social relationships determine institutional patterns of social development. Institutional exceptions are special rules, the application of which is limited to situational interpretations of social agents. The exceptions can be interpreted as an opportunistic violation of institutional commitments to other social agents or the entire community, or as a creative concretization of the institution, following its spirit and not the letter. In accordance with the dual interpretations, institutional exceptions can be classified by the number of persons, subjects who are under influence of the new rules, situations, targeted social relations or events, consequences. The activation of institutional exceptions occur in situations where the negative consequences of their implementation are minimal. Monitoring as a mirror reflection of institutions, suggesting the existence of ancestors. When new rules appear or the old ones are transformed, the new rules are formed in the context of the old ones. Exceptions are structured in binary oppositions. Situational interpretations replace the original meaning of regulations with a different or opposite meaning. The verbal construction of explanations and excuses are written on yes however foundations. The old norm of behavior is not wholly rejected. Its importance is constantly revised as comparison, evaluation, discussion, and/or by the introduction of new institutional practices. Like lawyers who use situational variety, have a potential for overestimation and create ambiguity in unclear formulations. Economic agents broaden a set of softening reasons of failure to observe norms, choosing rules that are regarded as deviations by the majority of agents. Institutional exceptions are deviant, if not openly, at least in some aspects. The gradual growth of deviant and half-deviant transactions broadens the sphere of normative permissibility and makes it possible to reevaluate common interpretations of social behavior. The extenuating circumstances will broaden until exact compliance with institutions that were regarded as a norm becomes the exception. When institutional exceptions are fixed in public discourse, it is obvious that there are some individuals who question conventional institutions and seek to replace them with new rules. Previous deviations are reinterpreted in a positive sense, while the external social pressure is rejected by conventionally new behavioral practices. Some cracks and dislocations within dominant institutions are first formed in behavior and then in group self-consciousness. Default rules that are embedded in institutional space in non-structured and chaotic forms are associated with the subgroup's deviant behavior within public consciousness. As institutional exceptions are formalized as new rules in new markets, social behavior, which was previously considered deviant, ceases to be perceived as such. Institutional exceptions are difficult to obtain recognition, to go beyond the behavioral status of the exotic, while their spread reaches a critical mass. In the tipping point, the vast majority uses the language of the minority that gets rid of the disadvantages and loses benefits of the status of marginality. Some social agents can receive opportunistic advantages from the implementation of the institutional exceptions. Social institutions are transformed, modified, edited, and connected with other norms by their carriers, who seek to diagnose, interpret, and offer different solutions to the actual problems, creating new meanings and meaningful patterns of social behavior. The theory of institutional disintegration explains how norms of behavior and opportunities of economic agents form markets and why the process of formation of effective rules are often reversed. Providing flexibility and adaptability of behavioral reactions, institutional disintegration creates a regulatory framework for the effective transformation of economic behavior of market actors. Economic sociologists like Freeman emphasize that market niches are social constructs, aiding to formalize the transformed patterns of market transactions. New institutions allow agents to use economic opportunities which are undervalued or not seen by the other market participants. The need for the development of new rules is one of the main problems in the development of any economic sphere. The experts emphasize that a significant part of market challenges of the Russian economy were tied to institutional defects. The fuzzy rules of registration of medical preparations don't allow the effective development of Russian pharmaceuticals. The development of the construction sector is largely constrained by outdated town planning code, and one needs to mitigate or abolish many of its rules. The development of high-tech industry is hindered by the lack of venture laws governing, for example, the sharing of options and warrants for employees of startups. Employees of such enterprises have a priority to purchase some company securities. This is one of the institutional reasons, along with better judicial protection of assets, why startups prefer to contract the option agreements with employees in foreign jurisdictions, mainly those which are regulated in accordance with British law. One of the factors of successful economic development of Western countries is a relatively quick normativization and legitimization of new institutional practices. Normativity allows the translation of original exceptions from opportunistic disorders into acceptable and formally recognized behavioral patterns in financial, trade, insurance, cultural spheres. It expands institutional space, providing more opportunities for market arbitrage. There appear additional opportunities for profit if the economic agent hedges risk by investing in different markets or acceptable types of commercial activities. The Soviet transitive crisis had largely arisen as a result of institutional inefficiency. These actualized behavioral practices, which were on the margins of social space, informal institutions became the foundations for economic development. They helped to overcome the rigidity of regulatory actions and the weakness of formal institutions. In the second half of the 1980s, New forms of economic behavior were de-deviantized. Such institutions were associated with the development of commercial activity, operations of individuals with foreign currency, the purchase and resale of Western consumer goods, etc., were decriminalized. New behavioral patterns formed new markets. The economic importance of institutional exceptions can be clarified using the example of markets that are created by subcultures. These markets are formed on the boundaries of interactions between the processes of social cultural development and economic rationality. There is no deterministic link. Institutional opportunities which are available in society for free cultural, spiritual, or religious expressions don't always guarantee the growth of innovations. However, if freaks of culture are protected from violent attacks from those who disagree with their way of expression, it is likely that freaks from technology will also feel confident. Their behavioral code implies adherence to the rules that the majority of society consider as questionable, inappropriate, or even dangerous. There are economic agents who hold the opposite to the dominant point of view in any market. As a rule, they are a minority, but they can be active. They have a new view on products, technology, standards, and rules of interactions with customers, etc. They don't believe in bans and choose risky behavior. They create original directions and trends. Their activities are often on the edge of the law and in some cases cross this line. Deviance and creativity sometimes overlap. Michael Milken, who created the market for junk bonds in 1990s, was convicted of fraud for 10 years in prison. He got out of jail less than 2 years. Unusual behavior in contemporary society is largely perceived as evidence of individual originality, creative talent, or protest activity. For example, in the USA in the 1960s, many protesters hipsters began to bake bread as a sign of protest against the dominant cultural and economic model. Such people are called adventurers, rebels, revolutionaries, or nonconformists. They prefer to try new things, designing it out of old elements, to do what others cannot do, to create what others cannot create. They like to position themselves in society as different from the majority. They are willing to take risks in the face of public disapproval, misunderstanding, or opposition. New markets or submarkets are formed by structuring economic transactions to meet the particular needs, social expectations, and distinctive norms of behavior. It is on the foundations of conscious opposition to the usual patterns of economic behavior that such social movements appear along with the relevant submarkets, as downshifting and slow food, which emphasize their otherness compared with fast food, strives to promote their unique foods. Their main institutional particularistic feature is a discrepancy of using the norms to conventional classical standards. Modern dance has hundreds of styles. There are different variations depending on aesthetic, philosophical, and emotional orientation, composition, musical accompaniment, choreography, presence of acrobatic elements, artistic figures, techniques and rhythm, etc., place that is used and time of action, the historical background of origin and borings, as well as fashion trends. New styles in contemporary dance are often seen as a departure from general rules. The founders, teachers, and performers of contemporary variations prefer experiments and innovative approaches, for example, combining movements from different styles, using unusual musical instruments, etc., and rejecting the canons of classical dance. Some areas and types of dance were initially considered indecent, but eventually they lost their deviant features and gained wide popularity. For street racers and bikers and some other directions in car culture, the perception of correct behavior on the road is different from the socially approved ideal. They perceive the rules more as a guideline rather than as a constraint, and their actions are largely demonstrative and of a flamboyant character. This doesn't mean that the other drivers don't violate any speed limits set by the authorities. Between norms and deviations in the road, there is a dotted line rather than an impenetrable wall. However, behavior, which for some people is an exception under the influence of a specific person or traffic situation, for others it is a marker of lifestyle or identity. If there are a number of economic agents who are self-organized and who, in market transactions, are governed by institutional exceptions, a submarket can be formed in which the standards of behavior will be the rules that were deviances in the previous market, the market ancestor. When Linus Torvalds in 1991 developed the code of the Linux system, for free download. Many programs and managers of software companies, in particular Bill Gates, criticized that decision as not conducive to the development of licensed software. However, thousands of programs began work on improving the open source system. Gradually, there were formed markets with proprietary software, open source software, and free software on which engineers get a comparable income. In the last two markets, mainly due to the monetization of users, free, freemium models, etc. Single institutional separation, differentiation according to behavioral patterns of interactions between performers and licensed users, has transformed the music industry. Many groups, especially among beginners, distribute free songs, collecting funding for the recording or filming of the clip through donations from fans. There is not much economic change, although the new submarket, of course, reduces profitability of economic agents operating in the old market frameworks, rather negative psychological reactions of the mainstream. In most cases, the market reactions to deviant behavior can be a soft form of social criticism, disapproval, or rejection, usually from leaders in the previous market, experts, consultants, and academic researchers. When, in 1976, John Bogle developed the first index mutual fund, most financial experts called it anti-American and mediocre. But there can be possible economic sanctions, prohibitions, or prosecution in traditionalist and authoritative societies. Violation is in dichotomy to normal behavior, and the submarkets are separated from regular markets. They are implemented into economic space in different institutional and organizational forms. These forms can be clubs, centers for sales of specialized equipment. For example, special spray paints are produced for the movement of graffiti art, and technology, special levers, pads, pumps, etc. are produced for street racing. Firms produce special equipment, helmets, action cameras, clothing, safety and flashing equipment, suspensions, ropes, etc. for train hoppers. Publishing of relevant literature and journals, production of consumer goods, clothes, shoes, badges, bags, jewelry, labels, etc. Educational workshops, lectures, seminars, webinars, and social events. The development of the economy is directly connected to increasing market alternatives. To understand which consumers, organizations, or firms are willing to follow rules and who is willing to violate them, and in order not to miss a possible structure of a new market niche, economic agents keep track of behavioral deviations. When a firm finds a group violating a rule, it can have a market potential. If one can find a group of consumers who are dissatisfied with existing institutions, who violate or fail to follow them, and offer them a new product which meets behavior expectations, allowing social agents to behave the way they want, not to make unnecessary transactions, saving time and other resources. One can form submarkets. Market is an institutional mechanism that allows economic agents to check behavior expectations of the organization of interactions in practice. The market is institutionalized as a behavioral syncretic whole, but with time sometimes it breaks down into segments connected by new changing patterns of behavior of consumers and of firms. Structuring a new market requires significant institutional differences, the rate of accumulation and or transmission of which depends on its behavioral characteristics. In the field of new technologies, submarkets are formed particularly rapidly. They often appear in the edge of social, economic environments, in gray areas in which traditional institutions are weak, leaving opportunities for innovative economic activity. It is no coincidence that molecular cuisine appeared in cosmopolitan London, and not the countries with strong culinary traditions such as Italy, Greece, or France. The formation of new markets can take several years, but costs are typically paid off by monopoly profits for those who succeed. New markets emerge in institutional space that is favorable to technical and social experiments. Hayek emphasized that effective society ensures the possibility of experimenting. Knowledge obtained through experiments, mistakes, and failures contributes to further innovations. In such an institutional environment, the development of legislation often lags behind the continuous process of improving technology. Furthermore, Laws have loopholes, body situations and double interpretations, which can be used by economic agents. When the market is filled with similar products, the attempts to stand out against this background will be inevitable. Sooner or later, they lead to the emergence of a new product, which is positioned in public discourse as an innovative juxtaposition to absolute technologies and/or non-broken rules. It is no coincidence that the target audience of innovative sectors is a progressive youth of large cities. What older generations perceive as unusual or complex for young people becomes a dominant style of behavior. Traditional patterns of market relations, for example with the banks to make a money transfer, are rejected by them as an unfashionable heritage of ancestors. Many consumer companies develop marketing departments whose employees, cool hunters or style scouts, are engaged in the study of emerging deviant trends among youth. They seek to find institutional practices which will be actively used in the future and which have a market value. Emerging markets don't always lead to the growth of quality. Molecular gastronomy is a new way of looking at the process of cooking, but its culinary and nutritional advantages compared with traditional cuisine are not obvious. However, many users of new markets preserve their fidelity, striving to stand out among other consumers. If such violations are conventionalized in public consciousness, and society formally or tacitly de-devanatizes former institutional exceptions in the form of acceptable practices or behavior in predetermined spatial and temporal frameworks, a submarket is formed serving the needs of individuals with a new identity. The identity of a scalper supposes aggressive operations in the stock, currency and commodity markets with large numbers of short-term intra-trade transactions. Their number depends on the psychological stability of the trader, his cognitive abilities, abilities to risk, etc. An economic agent positioning himself as an investor most likely will not use short-term financial operations, not because they are unprofitable, but just because they don't correspond to his self-image. It is impossible to act on the stock market as a scalper during the week and to become an investor on weekends. Although there may be a gradual transition from one group of professional market participants to the other one, the targeted behavior and institutions rather strengthen the associated identity than transform them. Such an institutional mechanism is a positive feedback reinforcement of the reproduction of identity. A stable identity is not formed in all markets. The social character of the out-identification impact of institutional exceptions on the structuring of submarkets can be clarified using the example of the Nobel Prizes. The award system established by the Royal Swedish Academy of Sciences can be regarded as a market space in which researchers and public figures on the one hand, the demand side, interact with organizations which awarded medals, the supply side, on the other. Among other interesting institutional effects of the matching markets, these are markets in which the preferences of the parties are structured in a hierarchical order. One can mention mismatch of timing of supply and demand. The demand is constantly increasing, as the number of researchers and the number of their studies that can be awarded grows each year, but the nominations remain unchanged. The number of awards hasn't changed, only from 1 to 3 researchers can be rewarded. To matching markets with similar institutional features, one can include clinical medical researches, the formation of family couples, the transplantation of organs, etc. The procedure for the award nomination includes the implementation of clear rules. There is no two-way communication between researchers and the organization prior to the announcement of the winner. Names of nominees are kept secret. A researcher cannot affect the process of award nomination directly, only through high-quality studies and significant scientific achievements, which were recognized by a significant part of the scientific community. Moreover, it is impossible to financially influence the organization's positive decision in favor of a particular candidate. However, the behavior that is deviant in one institutional system influence on the decision of the Commission may be allowed in adjacent submarkets that are forming. From the beginning of the 1990s, many public academies created in Russia have been sought loud-sounding awards and honors. These are public organizations which are formed by some researchers, businessmen, public figures like the Russian Academy of Natural Sciences, the Academy of the Humanities, the Academy of Social Sciences, etc. In some cases, a potential candidate may offer to pay the entrance fee voluntarily, and then as a member of the organization he can be nominated for receiving an award, a diploma or medal. As an option, an academic candidate may be asked to provide administrative and organizational assistance for the public organization. The organizers of the Nobel Prizes nomination are not responsible for the behavior of managers of such academies. These markets are linked neither geographically nor functionally nor in terms of participants, but have a common institutional link. Conclusions. The main methodological shortcoming of contemporary new institutionalism is the situational myopia. It is easy to clarify it using the example of the game space on the floor where babies are crawling. A social researcher who sees a room for the first time might conclude the social norms prescribing crawl are dominated in the microsocium. If he continues the observation for a while, he will notice as babies at different times try to get up and take a few steps. The researcher will say this is a transformational crisis. In society, there are those who disagree or who are not satisfied with dominant norms, culture, values, historic patterns of development, political regime, legal traditions, constitutional structure, party system, etc. A researcher combining academic work with political consulting may recommend that the government support those who stand up and or to impose sanctions against those who continue crawling. However, such an approach as political decisions based on it is unlikely to lead to the understanding of institutional patterns of social development. It is difficult to evaluate the functional meaning of social behavior if its history is unknown and there are no options to compare invariants. From a simple observation in time, it's not always obvious whether there is an institution that pushes economic agents to observable actions. Also, the direction of institutional evolution is not obvious. The institutional disintegration is a further social process. Its stages are difficult to isolate and evaluate. The institutional exceptions are accumulated by small steps, each of which is too small to be easily noticed. It is difficult to draw a clear line between a new institution and an old standard because in historical materials, as a rule, there are no unambiguously interpreted evidences about changes in behavior, and many gray areas where it's not obvious whether the new norm exists or not rarely attracts the attention of researchers. The theory of institutional disintegration emphasizes fragility of social behavior. An effective institution over time is often the cause of social degradation, and many exceptions, which were initially rejected and stigmatized by the majority, form new markets. In institutional game, winners are constantly changing. Institutional development is not a single event, but rather a multi-part series, the plot of which changes from time to time with unexpected twists and turns. History demonstrates success of different institutional patterns, and the correlation between success or failure of a state and a particular norm of behavior is not linear. Even a bad choice in the past is not able to lock society in an institutional deadlock.